Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Janus Academy's Historical Analogies course. This will be the 21st installment in our series, and this one is going to be dedicated to the relation between Expressionism and Neo-Expressionism. So this one is fairly obvious. Even the name suggests so, that we have stylistical formation appearing on the scene in the beginning of the 20th century. And then we have the reappearance of, well, not exactly the same thing, but a fairly similar thing. Now, we are here to discuss this time around not just analogies in terms of similarities, but also differences, because similarities have already been recognized. It's right there in the appellation, Expressionism and Neo-Expressionism. So we want to begin by addressing the previous analogy that we made, because the previous one was Romanticism and Expressionism. So we dealt with the presence of emotions, we dealt with very peculiar view of humanity and all of the things that Romanticism represented. We dealt with connections between Romanticism and nationalism in a way, because our whole take was that one comes out of the other. So yeah, we were talking about the connection that Romanticism had to Expressionism. And before that, of course, we were talking about the Paleologian Renaissance and Romanticism. Now, there's a connecting thread between all of these. There's really an important take on all of them, and except for Paleologian Renaissance, this particular set of stylistical formations mostly deals with the space that we nowadays call Germany. So we can say that both Romanticism comes from Germany, Expressionism in a very important manner comes from Germany, and a very significant section of Neo-Expressionism comes from Germany. We will address one very famous Neo-Expressionist painter that comes from the United States of America. This is Basquiat, but we will mostly be talking about German, that is European context, with people such as Baselitz and Kiefer. There are many other examples, of course, as you can imagine. We choose to focus on the most representative ones, or at least the ones that represent our take on the thing the best. Now, the reason why we are addressing Romanticism and how it connects to Germany is obviously multifold. We can address the fact that Germany was very involved with both World War I and World War II. They were a crucial part of the war. I don't need to explain this any further. We need to address the fact that it's a space that produced Romanticism, an incredibly important stylistical formation, but I would rather say era, because Romanticism is far too complex and far too profound and influential, globally speaking, to only be delegated to a stylistical formation, because we truly can talk about Romanticism in literature, in philosophy, in music, and no less important, we can talk about it in politics, because what comes out of Romanticism is nationalism, and we know that this is a profoundly influential ideology that is, to a certain extent, shaping the world in which we live in up to this day. But you could also say that it was driven by this particular ideology that we came to have the world that we live in today. We came to have the idea of the nation state. Now, a problem of the nation state is something that has a lot to do with the French Revolution. It's something that has a lot to do then later with Napoleon. And of course, it has very much to do with both World War I and World War II. Now, you can imagine that all of these stylistical formations are very much informed and influenced by all these important topics. When we're talking about Romanticism, we're also talking about aestheticism of ugliness, very important for both Expressionism and Neo-Expressionism. We're talking about grotesque, very important for both Expressionism and Neo-Expressionism. Now, I don't want to go too far with this. I don't want to make this a triple analogy or quadruple, if we're to bring a Paleologian Renaissance into all of this. I want to stick with Expressionism and Neo-Expressionism. I just wanted to say that there is a very strong connection with overall German context, Germanic context, if you will, and it has a lot to do with certain topics, with certain approaches that were indeed developed in Romanticism. And as you can imagine, this is a far deeper and far more complex story that we can talk about at great length, but we have a limited time frame here, so we're going to stick to it. Now, we need to, of course, address the heritage of World War I versus the heritage of World War II. And we know that World War I was incredibly informative for Expressionism, that artists like Emil Nolde or Otto Dix were very much shaped by this entire situation, by what it did to European culture, for all what it did to Germany, because again, this is the stylistical formation that mostly has to do with Germany. I want to focus on Otto Dix for a moment because I think he's very, very important for what we want to talk about when it comes to neo-expressionism. And he is the person that goes through this immense personal and spiritual transformation. I want to address a similar thing happening in the context of neo-expressionism later. When we talk about Otto Dix, we can of course talk about different stages of his work, about different stages of his development, and we can say that Otto Dix begins his artistic career just before World War I. And then if we look at his paintings that he's made before or at the eve of World War I, at the very beginning, we can see a very young, enthusiastic, of course, dramatic painter who is influenced by Nietzsche, a very Nietzschean character who is driven by ideals of heroism, of nationalism, of this whole idea of fighting the good fight, dying for your country, having a dramatic existence, truly living to the utmost potential, truly experiencing the world. So we see paintings that are very much in this line. And then, of course, World War I happens with all its horrors and all its absurdities, and we see Otto Dix breaking. Literally, if you follow the line of his works, not only his paintings, but especially his drawings and his etchings that he's made during the war, you can see his enthusiasm dropping, considerably. And then when the war is over, you can see a completely different person, a completely different take on things, different aesthetics, different everything. So what I want to address here is this idea of transition, and this idea that you can follow this transition, you can follow this development on the example of one single person. And this is something that will be very important for neo-expressionism, because we're going to be talking about another transitional period that is both retrograde and in a certain way, I wouldn't say optimistic, but forward-looking is what I want to say. So it looks both backwards and it looks forward, like Janus. So the whole thing with this is that we have a world that is also going through considerable transition. World after World War II is not the same. We have addressed this before. And the world is changing profoundly. The world is actually changing to such a pace that it's very difficult for people who live in it to fully adapt to it, to fully comprehend it, and to basically, live their lives in a sort of complete and, purposeful manner. And so we go back to what Romanticism brought about. We go back to this whole context of aestheticism of ugliness and of absurd and of grotesque that becomes very convenient way of depicting the world in which we find ourselves. Now, this is quite interesting when it comes to the period after World War II, because again, we know that this was the period of prosperity. We have addressed this before. So how come we have these incredibly pessimistic painters who at the same time are trying to look forward? This is where we come to the German context and why neo-expressionism is so strongly connected to Germany. Why we have these people who struggle with who they are, with what they are. Why do they struggle so much with the very concept of art? Why do they have this constant need to inspect the past, to look to the past, but then also to look to the future, to make the bridge between the two? Well, it all has to do, of course, with the post-World War II Germany. It has to do with the very German take on post-World War II, world, not to say Europe, not to say Germany. Because as we know, Germany lost that war fairly dramatically and definitively. It was a complete and non-conditional capitulation. And you could argue that the ideology that drove that country with which they've entered into the war, not to get into all of that thing, but we can all agree that that ideology was extremely ambitious. Right? So they had this idea that they would change the world, they would dominate the world, they would create the empire that was going to last for thousands of years. Now, this is something that is all really relevant and pertinent to the topic at hand, and this is going to be addressed in works of both baselitz and Kiefer. This is why I'm spending so much time to address it. This whole idea that what made Germany come into that war was this immense ambition. Total ambition, if you will, not to say totalitarian, though that would also be true. This idea that they were to truly build the world from ashes, they were to purify the world from what they saw as decadence and degeneracy. They were to bring forth, to usher in this era of eternal prosperity. Again, this was all incredibly ambitious. And then, of course, it ended with a resounding failure. They were not able to achieve none of these goals. Actually, what they were able to achieve was mass destruction and death of tens of millions of people, a lot of their own. So this was not exactly a resounding success. It was quite the opposite. And you can then understand how people who went through this war, or even who were just born into this context after the war, had this immense burden of disappointment, had this immense burden of failure. That they were faced with all the horrors of that regime. They needed to deal with that. They were made to feel guilty in front of the rest of the world, and you could argue rightfully so. When I say this, of course, I'm not talking about the people who were born after the war. I am talking about the general context in which Germany found itself. I am talking about this double consciousness that was instilled into these people that produced this kind of art. The double consciousness in question had to do with this lingering, remaining idea that these people were amazing, that they were hardworking, disciplined, honest, intelligent, whatever other stereotype you can attach to this particular nation, you're free to do that. So on one end, they are all of those things, and they have a very important industry. They produce goods of great quality. So all of that is great, but then on the other end, there's this, terrible deed that was done in very, very recent past, and a lot of themselves were personally involved. A lot of their parents were personally involved. So this is something that is really, really difficult to deal with, and this creates a very demanding and peculiar atmosphere. So when we're looking at neo-expressionism as a stylistical formation and as a school of thought, if you will, we are truly looking at a society that is, dealing with its demons that for the most part were inherited. That you could argue that not all of these people were a sympathizer of that totalitarian regime. Not all of them thought that concentration and extermination camps were a great idea. So not all of them were aligned with dominant ideology, but they shared living space. They shared same ethnicity, same nation, same language, same culture as the people that did. And this is enough to make you wonder. This is enough to make you ask yourself a couple of questions over the long period of time, especially when the entire world seems to be forcing you to ask yourself those questions. And we can say that this is, again, very similar to whatever was happening in that same country just a couple of decades ago. Because as we know, Germany also lost World War I, which was one of the dominant reasons why they ever went to World War II to begin with. They were made to pay drastic reparations. They were humiliated by the Allied winning powers, and this all installed a very considerable amount of resentment into the German people. Now, what was happening after World War II was somewhat different. You could argue that the Allied powers understood that they shouldn't humiliate the Germans again, because then we may have another war happening under the same premises. So instead of making them pay for incredibly steep reparations that they were not ever able to pay, they would invest a lot of money into them. So they would launch the Marshall Plan so as to prop up the German economy and so as to make it, at least as functional and as developed as it was before and during the war. Now, this all creates a very peculiar atmosphere. The one when we're talking, which we are talking about here, is that you have economic prosperity, you have development, you have strong middle class, all of these things. But on the other hand, you have this immense sensation of guilt. And you need to deal with this guilt because it's all consuming, it's devouring you, it's destroying not necessarily joy of life, but your very being as such. I'm talking about individuals as well as cultures. And this is something that we need to deal with. Also, the world has changed considerably between wars, because now we have the Cold War, we have all these things happening. Now, this seen from the German perspective has another layer to it, because Germany, as we know, was split into two pieces. It was split into Western and Eastern Germany, one capitalist, one communist. So not only did we have this divide of, let's say, after war prosperity and tremendous guilt on the other end, we also have the physical divide of this country into two. And therefore, it's not something that's hard to understand that art coming out of this context would also deal with a lot of divide, with a lot of division, the question of division, and how do we deal with this divide. And of course, we can yet again bring everything back to the medieval period, to the most famous dichotomy that we've been addressing this whole time, the dichotomy between spirit and matter, body and soul, and that whole thing. So when we're talking about neo-expressionism and how it happened in Germany, this is for all what we are truly talking about. We are talking about a very peculiar situation that has created a very peculiar type of art. Now, I need to address what I mentioned before, this whole idea of looking forward and looking backward. And I need to properly explain it now that we have some of the historical context covered. I need to, of course, go back to that totalitarian regime and their idea of culture and how they saw things that were and how they saw things that were to come. This will help us understand the aesthetic of neo-expressionism far better. And of course, this is something that would help us understand Romanticism, etc. Now, we have this generally European idea that true beauty comes from the classical age. It comes from Greco-Roman context. Most specifically, it comes from 5th century BCE Athens. We can be very geographically and temporally precise with this. Where is true beauty actually situated? So there is this idea that this is the period in human history when true beauty was present, when it reigned, and that it never truly happened, not to that extent. Now, this is a whole other thing that we're going to be addressing over and over again. What I want to address now is the aspect, a singular aspect of this particular attitude that has to do with ruins. Now, this is most important. This peculiar take on things is called the theory of beautiful ruins. And it posits something very interesting, that when we are looking, let's say, at the Greek statue that was made 2,500 years ago, roughly, we are looking at that statue in its perfect form. Now, what does this mean? It means that this statue, in most cases, not to say almost all of cases, but in most cases is damaged. There is something missing. There is a part of it or a piece of it. There's sometimes more than half of statue will simply be gone. So we have a lot of statues that lack legs, that lack arms, that lack heads. This is fairly common. Or we have statues that are just very badly damaged or mutilated. Now, you can have this entire discussion when it comes to Christianity and how early Christians defaced and broke and destroyed these statues intentionally. And that's a whole other story. But we don't want to address how and why they were damaged. We just want to address the fact that they were. And that European people developed this attitude over time that they were beautiful because they were damaged. And that damage to this statue was actually the finishing touch that time gave itself. That time was also acting as an artist. Be it a spontaneous damage, be it an intentional one, be it a damage from the earthquake or from an avalanche or from war or whichever other thing that happened, it doesn't matter. This statue was damaged, and it was good that it was, because it's actually better damaged than it is when it is whole. This is a very peculiar take on things, and this is something that was fairly recently, I think, researched in the field of neurology, and it was discovered that we take more pleasure, we take more aesthetic pleasure, more joy or enjoyment out of broken statues than we do out of whole ones. Because our minds are made to work a bit harder, they are made to be a bit more creative than they would have otherwise been, because we are driven spontaneously and I would say almost instinctually to complete the image that is in front of us. When we see a broken statue, we see something that is lacking. So let's say if a statue is missing an arm and it comes from here, we don't really know what the rest of the arm is doing. Is it like this? Is it like this? Is it, whichever other way this arm can be? We don't know. So it makes our mind race trying to complete the image, trying to make sense of it. And the fact that our mind is racing, the fact that we are engaged in this creative endeavor ourselves, make it all the more pleasurable for us to spectate this particular damaged work of art. And the more this work of art is damaged, the greater our pleasure is. Now, of course, this is a fairly recent theory, and to my knowledge at least, and we have had this theory of beautiful ruins before that. I think that a considerable part of it has to do with notion of time. It's just that if something survived for a very long time, it must have been important, and we must have preserved it as a society, a civilization, with good reason. So when we are saying that something has been around for, 3,000 years or 2,000 years, it probably was important to a certain extent if we bothered to preserve it for such a long time. So there is that aspect of it as well. And the best way for us to understand that a lot of time has passed is that we are able to see physical traces of it. We are able to see traces of damage. Now, all of this to say that German Expressionism builds on top of this one thing that already existed and was already wholeheartedly adopted by the previous totalitarian regime that they came after and that they were trying to deal with and that they were trying to make sense of, and that, yes, they were very much perplexed by how to exist in a world after World War II. That theory of beautiful ruins. We know that Albert Speer designed the city of Berlin that was supposed to be renamed to Germania and that was supposed to be the center of the world. This is, by the way, the preoccupation of every nascent empire or every potential or pretended empire, that they want to have the capital city that is going to be the center of the world. So we have Rome, of course, as one of the centers of the world, not necessarily the original one. We may talk about this some other time. We also have Paris acting like it at a certain period of time. We have Washington, D.C. acting like it, and many other cases. The point is that this particular regime wanted Berlin to act as such, and they made extensive renovations to Berlin trying to make it in this image. They wanted to create the new Rome, and they were so ambitious about it, they worked so hard on it that they provoked this Europe-wide, how should we put this, Europe-wide shortage. So they provoked the Europe-wide shortage of both marble and granite, because these were the materials they would use, the noble materials, to build this new center of the empire, center of the world. Now, this is the catch. They only thought, Albert Speer, only thought that this city would be beautiful 2,000 years into the future. They were not making it to be pretty now for their own time, to their contemporaries. No, they built it to be pretty 2,000 years in the future when it's in the state of relative ruin. They saw the city of Rome, with which they were inspired, as beautiful today, meaning in their own day, to their contemporaries, not back, let's say, in the 1st century or 2nd century when Rome was arguably at its peak. No, they thought that Rome was at its peak at their time, which means the middle of the 20th century. And of course, we know that Rome in the middle of the 20th century, was not terribly different from Rome today, that most of these Roman sites were in a state of ruin. But that's kind of the point. It was beautiful because it was in a state of ruin. And all of this to say that if we want to properly understand the aesthetics of Baselitz and the aesthetics of Kiefer, we need to understand that it is profoundly informed by this theory of beautiful ruins, especially when it comes to Baselitz, because he is someone who deals extensively with fragments. He makes fragments a really big deal. And I want to connect this yet again to Otto Dix and his take on World War I, and then his take on the society after World War I. So there's a very strong analogy to be made between these two artists, because Otto Dix really paints, first of all, World War I as this incredibly absurd, tragic downfall of humanity, which it was, he paints it as the society collapsing, really. And everything that was held important and precious and dear to us is collapsing, never to be reformed, never to be healed again. So truly, he is a painter of decadence. It's no surprise that his paintings were exhibited in the exhibition of degenerate art that was mounted by this totalitarian regime, and they were labeled as, unwanted, let's put it politely. But the thing is that Otto Dix is really painting the society after World War I as entirely corrupt and existing in the state of ruin. This is the most important aspect of it. So when he is depicting this society, he's truly depicting ruins, fragments, and basically an empty shell of what once was. So we're not going to go too deeply into Otto Dix and his particular take and why he uses aestheticism of ugliness in all of this. We're just using him to highlight this important trait that is present with George Baselitz. We see two important things. First of all, is that we see this idea that he wants to turn paintings upside down. And this is quite important because it tells us something about society. It tells us something about absurd in the world. It tells us something about meaning. It's not just a gimmick that he turns paintings upside down. It also bears more serious, more deeper tones. And this is something I want to address, the motivation of why he would turn a painting upside down. Well, one of the reasons, and I would argue one of the main reasons, has to do with Romanticism. Again, it has to do with Expressionism, because he drives this idea that art feeds itself from banality, from everyday things, from the trash heap, or if you will, again, from ruins. So the art feeds itself from everything that is on the bottom. If you want to look at the society or really any other thing, metaphorically, if you want to adopt this spatial metaphor, you can say that the things that are not that important are on the bottom and the things that are very important are on the top. So we have this vertical vision of the world that is, again, very medieval, where we are looking at things stratified and hierarchically aligned. So again, most important things are on the top, the least important things are on the bottom. And if we reverse this, we get to this very medieval situation that we know as the carnival, that we have inversion of societal mores, of societal values. We have the world that explicitly doesn't make sense anymore, or it makes the opposite of sense. Because if we turn the image upside down, what was on top is now on the bottom. What was seen as the elite, as chosen few, what was seen as superior quality, now comes to the bottom, and vice versa. Now, you could argue that this is something that Otto Dix was very much persuaded of. He saw society as making no sense after World War I. He saw the fall of all of the values that were the backbone of Europe, or at least how he saw it. And he found himself in the world that made no sense. So you could say that Otto Dix sought salvation from this in religion. He became very religious. His later paintings attest of this. Whereas George Baselitz, or Georg Baselitz, rather, embraced this and ran with it. And he presented paintings that were not only turned upside down, but were also dealing with this notion of fragments. That is really important. He focalized on bits and pieces. He would not represent, for example, a complete body quite as often. He would focus more on body parts. And this, of course, has to do with what we were just talking about, the theory of beautiful ruins, this visual or plastic synecdoche, if you will. Synecdoche is a figure of style that comes from the world of literature, but also exists in the world of painting, and it has to do with representation of an entire thing by one of its aspects. So it's pars per toto. You represent one thing by just one part of it. Let's say you see a hoof and you know that it's a horse, or you see a horseshoe and you hear the sound of horseshoes clinging, making noise, so you think of the entire horse. So this would be an example of a synecdoche. And a lot of this has to do with beautiful ruins. A lot of it has to do with aesthetics of Georg Baselitz. I may say George Baselitz some other time. Please don't hold it against me. So the whole idea is this, that we are dealing with the world that exists in the state of ruin, and we are dealing with the world that exists in state of fragments. We are not dealing with totality. And this, of course, may be a direct commentary on this previous totalitarian regime that did see the world as totality, that wanted to build the world as totalitarian. And what does this mean? Of course, well, it means that you have regime in power that seeks to address every particular aspect of human existence. It's not a regime that is only interested in ideology or politics or economics, or let's say religion, or let's say mores. No, this is the kind of regime that wants to take care of everything. Now, I'm not saying that this is a good or a bad thing. I'm just giving an explanation of what it is. We find ourselves over and over again in the world that seems to be increasingly ever more fragmented. And this is what neo-expressionists are dealing with. This is what they're trying to explain. And this is what informs their aesthetics as well as their poetics. You could argue that the first major blow to the total or totalitarian worldview was the French Revolution. Again, something that has a lot to do with Romanticism. This is when church lost its primacy. This is when church was even made illegal for a brief period of time. And when we didn't really seek the center of our spirituality with the church, with the notion of Christian divinity, we started seeking it elsewhere. And you could argue that when I say we, I mean, broadly speaking, Western European culture and its influences all over the world through colonialism, tried finding this spirituality elsewhere. But we've lost this idea of the world as a totality that makes sense, not to say perfect sense, but that makes sense. And we have found ourselves in the world that is, made of fragments, that it's made of broken puzzle pieces. And this is something we'll address in our other courses. This is a very, very important notion. We'll be talking about ruins in a very detailed manner from the archaeological point of view. We'll be talking about fragments in historical point of view, and this idea of us always trying to recreate the world. Now, if we're talking about Georg Baselitz, so we are not necessarily talking about this attempt to recreate the world. He is not quite as ambitious as an artist. He is basically addressing the state of the world. And I would address the fact that Georg Baselitz, or George Baselitz, is a postmodern artist. He is someone who lives in, I would say, chronologically speaking, he lives in the period of postmodernity. So he lives after World War II. He creates after World War II. And postmodernity, as we said previously, was labeled, and it still is really labeled, by this refusal of grand narratives, of great ideas, of grand solutions. It's really more interested in inspecting them or mocking them or just deconstructing them or simply questioning them. And you could argue the same for him. So he is not someone who is a modernist who is willing to present great visions of the future. He is a postmodernist. He is content with analyzing and kind of mocking or kind of just registering whatever is going on in the world. So when he paints fragments, and when he paints fragments in this particular manner, this is what it has to do with. It has to do with him coming to terms what it means to be a German after World War II. It means coming to terms with being a part of the people that had this grandiose, incredibly ambitious idea, a monumental idea, really, that a lot of the rest of the world saw as incredibly evil. Again, rightfully so, especially if you come from the part of the world as I come, which is Slavic, and which was seen as the major threat to their vision and the people they sought to exterminate. So yeah, you do not really agree with this. But you can say that the idea was ambitious and it was totalitarian. So people who came to live in the world after that idea has failed found themselves really in the world that was shattered and the world that made very little sense. Now, you could say the same thing that is present in the work of Kiefer. And this is yet another very interesting take. I would say when Kiefer is at hand more ambitious than with Baselitz and with a deeper take, with the more spiritual take, which would again take us back to the medieval period on one end and Romanticism on the other, but certainly to Expressionism. Because if you look at the aesthetics and poetics of Kiefer, you will see that, first of all, they're profoundly spiritual, and that this is something that he says himself. When he speaks of his art, he claims it to be very, very spiritual, and he claims this to be his artistic ambition. He creates art with this particular notion in mind. He wants it to be that way, but it really has to do with this notion that we already discussed, that we just discussed when we spoke of Baselitz, that he wants to start from the bottom. This takes us back to why Baselitz flips his paintings upside down, and why he seeks to begin from the low post, why he seeks to start from the very basest of notions as well as the very basest of materials. This is a fairly widespread attitude that art feeds itself off of garbage. And I'm not talking about new realism here that we have discussed previously. I'm talking about this as a more general notion. This is one of the ways in which you can observe art. If it's visual or verbal, it doesn't really matter. If it's musical, there is this idea that some people espouse that art is always inspired by the lowest of impulses. It's always feeding itself from the garbage heap, and it flourishes in the garbage heap. So it's this idea that I guess is a variant of Aristotle's idea and theory of catharsis, that art deals with expulsion and with actualization, if you will, of the worst fears and traumas and anxieties, evil spirits, if you will, and for it to be that way, it needs to be connected to the very worst of humanity, to the very bottom of humanity. You could argue that the works of Genet, a very famous French playwright and writer, and to a certain extent theoretician, go along with this, that he is interested in crime, he is interested in all sorts of transgressions, be they societal or illegal or sexual or moral. He is into transgression full on. So he sees art as being about crime. Art and crime, that's one and the same thing. Now, Kiefer and Baselitz, they don't quite go that far, but they do want their art to deal with something that is seen as banal and lowly. So not quite as banal and lowly as is the case with pop surrealists, lowbrow, because there it has a very humorous term, and it has this very cynical but I would say joyful, very dark but very joyful at the same time inspiration, whereas here this is really just being at the bottom, starting at the bottom of everything. Now this is present with Kiefer in very clearly in terms of materials that he uses, because he insists on making, I would say, paintings, but they're not necessarily paintings, because sometimes there's not a lot of paint involved, but let's say paintings, works of visual art, let's put it that way. He makes them from very lowly materials. He makes them from materials that are not at all adapted to, this particular media. So he makes them out of hay, for example, or from mud, or from lead. And we know that these are not standard painters or generally artistic materials, if for nothing else but for the fact that hay is not terribly durable as material. I mean, we've spent hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, experimenting with different materials, with different paint and different stones or alloys, or different other materials, so that we could find the most durable ones. We've experimented with oil painting, with tempera, with many different forms of paint, trying to establish which one lasts the longest and which one produces the best qualities. Now here comes Kiefer saying, I don't need any of that, I don't care, I'm going to make my, again, paintings, I'm not sure, installations, let's put it that way, out of hay and out of mud and out of dung, of all things. And he does, and arguably they look tremendously well. They are very impressive, they are very moving, they're very emotional, and as he says, they're very spiritual. But he insists that he doesn't want to deal with noble materials, he doesn't want to deal with durability. And then you can also say that this is a commentary to the failure of this totalitarian ideology that sought to be there for thousands of years that truly sought eternity. They were building their capital city to be beautiful 2,000 years in the future. So obviously they were very invested in the future. But these guys explicitly, especially Kiefer, through usage of materials that are not durable at all, that are very ephemeral, they explicitly renounce the future. Now, they look to the future, as we said. Now, he thinks about the future, but because when he's choosing a material, he is intentionally choosing a material that doesn't last for a very long time, and it's going to be very difficult to preserve. But he thinks about it. He refuses it to a certain extent. Or you could say that he refuses to create art that would be close to that ambitious ideal that sought eternity, and that spectacularly failed. So he creates something that is the polar opposite of that. Instead of building a city out of granite and marble, very noble materials, he makes paintings of hay and of dung. And there's something else when you use dung and mud and hay. These are very organic materials. So there's a very important aspect of this, because when we make, well, a painting or a statue, or it doesn't really matter, we tend to use non-organic matter. In many cases, we use stone one way or the other. Why do I say this? Because most of paint is made of ground stones. It's made of minerals. Not all of it, but a fair portion of it. So the idea is that when you make a statue, you make it out of stone. This is something that is not organic matter, and it's very durable. Or you make it out of bronze, that again, not organic matter, but very durable. And even if you make a painting and you use, well, traditional paint, a lot of that is ground minerals too. So again, non-organic matter. Which makes sense, because you are making something that belongs to the domain of art, which means domain of artifice. So by definition, it's not organic, it's artificial. Artificial. Kiefer doesn't want that. He wants his art to be made of, well, dung. And you could argue that, okay, one aspect of this is explicitly clear. It's very not only ephemeral, but in many ways offensive material. There is something incredibly lowbrow about dung, but again, not lowbrow in the American manner, which is kitschy and campy and cynical, but lowbrow in a very direct, very down-to-earth, I mean literally, manner. And he seeks to create out of it. He, in a way, makes a connection between whatever was happening before and whatever happens again. He sees the previous regime as being incredibly ambitious and failing spectacularly. They wanted noble materials, they wanted perfection, they wanted beauty, they wanted eternity, and they've done what they've done. So he doesn't want that. He wants everything that is the opposite to that. He wants base materials. He wants things that do not last. He creates works of art that are arguably not beautiful, certainly not in the common sense of that term. And he makes them to be very, very ephemeral in nature. If you make installation out of hay and dung, it's not going to last for a very long time. Let's just put it that way. Or rather, it's going to be a very difficult task to make it last a long period of time. But that's something for curators to think about, and for museum staff, so it's up to them. Now, there's another aspect of Kiefer's work that is interesting here, and that is the fact that he also uses lead. Now, if you're thinking about metals, lead is seen as one of the basest ones. So it's not gold, it's not silver, it's certainly not titanium, nor is it mercury, nor is it any of these, how should I say, interesting, beautiful, very useful metals, like let's say iron is very useful, although not as beautiful as silver or gold. But lead is really the basest of them all. It's just very heavy and poisonous. But lead also has a very big role in alchemy. It's a very, very important material for alchemy and everything that has to do with it. Alchemy, not just as a way to try to create gold, but as a way truly to try to understand the universe and to try to rule the laws of creation itself, to try to rule the universe. If you think about what alchemists were trying to do, they were trying to create gold, but not necessarily because they wanted to be rich by creating the gold, no, but because they thought gold was divine and that gold was truly sunlight incarnate, and that sunlight had a lot to do with divinity, that it had a lot to do with God, with divine nature. So when they were trying to create gold, in a way, they were truly trying to recreate God, which is an immensely ambitious affair. Now, Kiefer, of course, on one end, refuses all ambition by using these base materials, by creating in the realm of aestheticism of ugliness, by connecting himself also, much like Baselitz, to this whole story of fragments and of failure and of humiliation that Germany has suffered twice in the 20th century. But he also drives this ambition that out of these they will rebuild and they will grow and they will get to superior realms of existence. Lead in this regard is incredibly important because, as we know, alchemists in many cases were trying to turn lead to gold. So the idea was that you take something base and you make it noble. And this is, I would say, a defining feature even of his aesthetics, is that he is taking something base, he is taking base materials, and he is trying to turn them into something noble. It's obviously a very long road. It's something they begin from a very low post because, again, humiliation and failure and all of these other things. But it's something they present as ambition. So I think it's quite interesting to put it this way. I think it's interesting to see that out of this great despair, they're trying to build the new start, and they are already putting plans of this great ambition that they want to seek lofty goals, ambitious goals that would be on par with the ones that alchemists had. And Kiefer himself said that he used lead because it had to do with alchemy. So this is not just our interpretation, this is what he said himself. And he said that to him, again, it had a lot to do with the medieval context. And he saw his, now of course, again, this is him saying it, not us interpreting it, that medieval context had a lot to do with alchemy, it had a lot to do with divinity and spirituality. And we started by saying that his work is immensely spiritual, and it is. We started by saying that this is really what defines him as an author, this intense spirituality, this idea that he is trying to infuse these base matters with spirit. And this is exactly what alchemists were trying to do when they were trying to turn lead to gold. Now, what kind of spirituality is this? It's quite an interesting thing to address because, again, we're talking about the analogy between Expressionism and Neo-Expressionism. We're talking about people like Emil Nolde and Otto Dix on one end, and then people like Kiefer and Baselitz, and then later we'll get to talk about Basquiat on the others. So we have people who create out of desperation, they create out of misery, out of humiliation, but they seek, how should I say, the light at the end of that tunnel. What I want to insist upon, and then we'll close the talk on Kiefer, is that he seeks unity between spirit and matter. He is deeply Christian about this when he thinks that even the basest of matters hold the capacity to become noble, to turn themselves. It's if you're familiar with the process of transubstantiation, when the little wafer, little bread, becomes the body of Christ, amongst other things, it's a very, well, I wouldn't say banal. No bread is banal. Every bread is noble in its essence, but it's something that is material, right? Let's just put it this way. And that it's fairly easy to make. It becomes spiritual, eternal, and truly perfect, as is the body of God. And this is something that Kiefer is interested in. When he's using mud, when he's using lead, hay, dung, he uses most base materials that he seeks to infuse with utmost amount of spirituality, and not just amount, but also quality. So it's this attitude that you can infuse noblest of spirits into just about everything, even in the lowest of matters. And again, if you think about the German people being the lowest of the low after they've lost the war, they fell from this immense ambition they had to rule the world and to recreate the world in their image, as twisted as it may have been. They fell from that lofty goal to the position where they were the absolute pariah of the entire world, where they were despised and mocked and indeed humiliated by the rest of the world. So you can see the reflections of this in Kiefer's aesthetics and in his method. Now, another interesting thing about this, and we will get to Basquiat in a minute, is that we have this whole spirit and mind dichotomy acting in work of neo-expressionism, amongst other things, because this is, chronologically speaking, the period of conceptual art. Conceptual art becomes a really big deal and is increasingly so during these people's lives. And conceptual art, as we know, is purely spiritual. It's completely divorced from matter. Now, these guys are trying to, well, these guys and girls are trying to bring art back to its material roots. They're trying to have art be both about matter and spirit. They don't want it to be just about matter. They don't want it to be just about spirit. They want art to have this carnal and material dimension. And this is another reason why these people act as they do. Now, one other important way of us looking at neo-expressionism is that it's an attempt from European artists, in this case German artists, to bring art back to Europe. Because what's going on after World War II is that United States of America become arguably a dominant global hegemon, the center of the artistic world, as well as they are the center of the economic and military and, well, cultural world. So they also become the center of artistic world. This is no longer Paris or Berlin, as it was perhaps in the 10s and the 20s and partially the 30s. No, this is now New York and other American cities. So in New York, we have the famous New York scene when it comes to conceptual art, when it comes to abstract expressionism, when it comes to abstract lyricism or action painting or color field painting and all these other things. So this is an attempt for art to come back to Europe, and it is an attempt that's done especially with aesthetics of expressionism, that is neo-expressionism, because again, expressionism comes from Germany. Of course, we've had expressionist painters from other places, excellent painters, very famous ones, but it's mostly associated to Germany. And so we left Basquiat for the end because he is a bit of an exception to all of this, because we are talking about this grandiose attempt for art to be brought back to Europe, for art to regain its material essence and material presence. This is a reason why this art has been criticized a fair amount, because it was seen as retrograde, it was seen as a step back, as reactionary to a certain extent, and so on. So whatever happens with Basquiat happens in a completely different part of the world that, again, is decidedly not European. And while Basquiat does belong to neo-expressionism, and while he does, as such, connect to expressionism and romanticism, especially, I would argue, romanticism, he is fairly different in many important aspects. And one of the aspects in which he's different in, I would say, is that he becomes famous incredibly early on in his life. He has this meteoric rise to fame and success. He basically becomes famous almost immediately. Now, this is fairly strange that you have a young guy who drops out of school on a couple of occasions, who spends some time being homeless and living in squats and all of these things, and starts doing graffiti, starts doing street art, and then turns attention at himself, at his work, and immediately lands some very famous people. Basically, first couple of paintings he's ever sold was sold to celebrities like Andy Warhol, like Debbie Harry, people of that caliber. And it's as if the moment he starts creating, he becomes a thing, he becomes super famous, and then, sadly, as we know, he dies very young as well. So it's this whole idea of a comet, of incredibly bright celestial event that doesn't last for a very long time. And this is what Basquiat is. But I don't want to talk about his fame, that in many cases is a bit banal. I don't want to talk about his success. I want to talk about other things that are quite important about Basquiat, especially this one thing that will prove to be incredibly well relevant and influential in world of art, but that we don't really talk about that much, it seems, when we address Basquiat. And this is the fact that although he achieves very early success, although he gets to present the Documenta, I think when he's 21, which is very, very young for an artist. When you're 21, you're still supposed to be at the Academy of Fine Arts. And he gets to present at the Whitney Foundation also very, very young. He succeeds very young. He is not taken by museums. Museums seem to ignore Basquiat, and this lasted as a situation, well, for a considerable amount of time. If we look at his, I say, sadly short life. He becomes famous through private acquisitions, through friendship with famous people, dealing with fashion, dealing with, well, that entire glitzy, mundane world. But museums seem to ignore him, and we start seeing this divide. This is the really important part of the story of Basquiat. This divide between private collections and private galleries on one end, and then museums as state institutions on the other, because these start profiling themselves as two separate worlds. Now, this is a very broad story, and I'm looking at the time, we're running out of it, so we're not going to be talking a lot about it, but suffice to say that this is the tendency that's been around from the times of the Renaissance, that we've had private mecenas, that we had private initiative. But in those times, private initiative was contrasted to the church. In most cases, it was the church that would be the main sponsor of arts. Then, after the French Revolution and with the advent of the nation state, national state, it's, well, the state that's the main sponsor of the arts. And we have museums as really institutions of the state par excellence. They acquire works of art, so you measure your artistic success, you measure your artistic achievements by how much you're accepted and recognized by the state institutions. And of course, it's not just the museums, it's also academies of fine arts, so you can become an academic. It's a really big deal. But Basquiat doesn't become any of these things. He is espoused by the private sector, he is espoused by private investors and private collectors, and of course other artists, famously like Andy Warhol. But he is fairly ignored by the museums. And this is something that is seen really as detrimental to museums rather than to Basquiat, because we know him nowadays to be a very famous, very successful, very accomplished artist. But yeah, it's also this other idea that I want to address that has to do with Romanticism, and it's how he's doing his art. So it's not just very peculiar aesthetics that is very, well, neo-expressionist, not to say expressionist, that he uses these very strong lines, these very in-your-face expressions, of course, aestheticism of ugliness. It's very aggressive, it's very bold, it's very brash. But it's also the fact that he starts and he continues mostly by dealing with street art. He does graffiti. And he does graffiti in very peculiar aesthetics and by using, well, materials that you use when you make graffiti. So this is very far, again, from this idea of museum painting that's made in oil on canvas style and that whole thing. This is something that has to do with street art, street culture. It has to do with general culture of hip-hop. And with that entire idea that you take art from institutions, not just to the private sector, but also to the streets. You popularize art. Art becomes a thing of the people. Who makes street art? Well, people who, by definition, by default, don't have access to museums. People who don't have access to academia. They don't go about art in these, not to say legal, but let's say usual channels, which would be that you go to the, let's say, not necessarily Academy of Fine Arts first. You need to go to some sort of artistic high school first, then Academy of Fine Arts. Then you start exhibiting. You make exhibitions here and there. And then eventually your work is noticed and picked up by some museum, and then you can consider yourself a success. So this is not at all what Basquiat does. He does it in a completely different manner. He does street art, and this is how his art becomes recognized and known and appreciated. So this is what we start having appearing more and more and more. You could argue that one of the most famous artists nowadays is Banksy, a person who is anonymous. I mean, we don't know who that is, in theory at least, and he also began as street artist. So this is a very radical statement that art doesn't have to do with institutions. It has to do with streets. Now, of course, this is all incredibly hypocritical and cynical, because if you were to buy a Basquiat painting today, you could not afford it. It would not be available to the people who spend their times in the street. It would be worth enough to merit its position in a museum or in a very expensive private collection. But you get the point, that this is something that has to do with Romanticism, because Romanticism is the era that begins insisting on this lowly approach to art, and that art can come from other realms than ones of eternal truths and beauties, etc. Now, we have passed our time, I think, a couple of minutes already, so I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm just going to quickly underline the difference between Basquiat as an American phenomenon on one end, and Baselitz and Kiefer as European phenomena on the other. You can kind of see how similar they are, how different they are, different more than similar. And you can see again how this historical analogy machine is operating, because here we have, I would argue, quadruple analogy, not just double. It's not just neo-expressionism and expressionism, it's also romanticism, and it's also Paleologian Renaissance. So we have repetition of certain themes, we have repetition of certain themes and motifs and techniques, and really worldviews that keep coming back. Now, what I also want to add, and I should have said this before in our previous lecture, with this particular lecture, we start entering into the realm of what we can consider contemporary, because some of these people that we're talking about are still alive, and their work is still very relevant. Their work is still seen in contemporary galleries. We're not talking about history anymore, so we're going to be more and more talking about people who will make a part of our current artistic landscape. And I think this is something that's important to understand, especially when we see traces of previous eras in their work, and especially when their work is dedicated quite explicitly to the past eras and to the concept of the past. In this particular case, very importantly, attached to the notion of fragments and the notion of past failures, past ambitions, and broken dreams. So let's wrap it up at that. What a beautiful way to end. Highly optimistic as ever. I thank you for your attention. I hope this made sense, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. Ciao.